Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. We're happy to have Mark Pomerantz with us. Mark is a premier lawyer with blue ribbon credentials. He was a law clerk to the legendary trial judge Edward Weinfeld and later to conservative Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. He served many years as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, principally bringing cases against members of the organized criminal syndicate. Thereafter, he rose to become chief of the criminal division in that office. He has taught law at Columbia Law School. As a defense lawyer, he represented many high-profile defendants and eventually became a litigation partner in the Paul Weiss firm. Maintaining his passion for public service and dedication to the rule of law, he volunteered his services to New York County District Attorney Cyrus D. Vance in his criminal investigation into the finances of Donald Trump, resigning his position shortly after District Attorney Alvin Bragg took office. We're pleased to welcome Mark Pomerantz to the program.
Well, thank you, Jim. You're very gracious. All of those things seem like a long time ago. These days, I sit at home, fully retired, mostly fully retired.
You can look back on a very gratifying career.
It's been a long and gratifying career, it's true.
Now, we'll give our audience a lesson in basic civics. We hear a lot these days about the rule of law. What is the rule of law and why is it so important?
Well, our nation is predicated on the belief that society should be organized under law, that it is the law that ought dictate what people do and how they should behave, and not a ruler, a king, arbitrarily saying, do this, don't do that. So it's become received wisdom in the United States that ours is a system where we live under the rule of law and not under the rule of man. And it means many things to many different people, but certainly one of the things it means is that everyone should be held accountable for wrongdoing, whether they are the lowest of society's ranks or at the very top of society. And indeed, you mentioned Judge Weinfeld. Part of his standard jury charge was that all parties stand as equals before the bar of justice. And he lived according to that rule and treated every party before him with the same degree of respect and attention. In fact, he would tell his law clerks that there's no such thing as an important case, because every case is important to the litigant who has brought it or who is defending it. And it doesn't matter what one's station is in life. The law treats everyone equally.
Well, we've lived through a period of cases that even Judge Weinfeld might have deemed important. But we live in face it, a deeply polarized society where there's very little agreement or commitment to compromise between the two factions. And so we have inevitably prosecutors who may be Democrats, and we have prosecutors who may be MAGA Republicans. Now, is there any rule that a Democrat may only prosecute Democrats and that a MAGA Republican can only prosecute MAGA Republicans, or else there's something wrong with the prosecution?
Well, look, of course, there's no such rule. What every prosecutor, Democrat or Republican, is supposed to do is make decisions based on the facts and based on the law. The politics, the expedience of politics is not supposed to enter into the equation of how a prosecutor approaches a case, whether to bring a case, whether not to bring a case. It's supposed to be a function of the things that prosecutors, by long-standing law and tradition, should allow to govern their actions. What are those things? What are the facts? Did they establish a crime? What's the law? Does the law establish that the person being investigated committed a crime or not? Are there mitigating circumstances? Are there aggravating circumstances? And then one applies professional judgment and reaches a decision on whether to proceed or not to proceed. Nowhere in that list of things that a prosecutor is supposed to consider is the politics of the person on the receiving end or the potential defendant.
In a case involving corruption on the part of, or alleged corruption on the part of a highly placed individual in our government, politics does enter into it, doesn't it?
It's inevitable that if there's an investigation or a prosecution of an elected official, it is perhaps inevitable that the electoral opponents of the person charged will make hay out of the fact that there's been a prosecution. It's appropriate to make that hay. If an elected official has committed a crime in the political arena, you have to expect that the political opponents will point to the indictment as a reason not to support this person. It becomes easy as well for an indicted person to say, look, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm being prosecuted only because of my politics. It's a charge that is easy to make and difficult to rebut.
So we hear a lot about the weaponization of the justice system. Trump repeatedly claimed he was a victim of weaponization. Now it appears he's using weaponization. But, I mean, you take any kind of criminal case. You take an organized crime case with which you're intimately familiar. A prosecutor indicts a member of the five families. That's a weaponization of the law against organized crime. Nothing wrong with that.
Of course there's nothing wrong with that. The notion of the government being weaponized, as you point out, a criminal prosecution is a weapon in and of itself. It's directed usually at depriving a person of their reputation, their freedom, their assets. So yes, it has profound consequences for the person on the receiving end. But what one weaponizes a prosecution for is against misconduct. It's to protect society. You don't weaponize a prosecution for political purposes. It's ironic that the notion of weaponization, when it comes out of the voice of the present administration, you have to think back to the chant, "Lock her up," during political rallies, which is the quintessential form of weaponization. So I think it's a bit rich that the claim of weaponization has been advanced by the very person or people that first began that cry of "lock her up."
But in a political campaign, it's not uncommon to say, throw the rascals out, or the mayor is on the take, or the mayor knows, had dinner 3 weeks ago with an organized crime figure, and whether it's true or it's false. Those types of charges are quite common.
I think you're absolutely right, and we have to recognize that whenever there's an investigation or a prosecution of a political figure, there'll be public comment about the role that politics plays. But that public comment ought not enter into the prosecutor's calculation of what to do.
Now, in the case of Donald Trump, he, of course, charged the Justice Department and the special prosecutor with weaponization, and certainly charged the New York County District Attorney with weaponization in the case that was brought. It also, when coupled with attacks on the judiciary, because judges, at least in the federal system, are appointed through a political process. They're appointed by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate. And you have democratically, with a capital D, appointed judges and MAGA appointed judges.
Of course.
And quite often we've seen Republican judges taking Democratic positions and Democratic judges taking Republican positions because that's the independence of the judiciary. But when you couple the weaponization of the Justice Department with attacks on judges, in fact, threats to impeach them, which are groundless because you don't like their decisions, doesn't that undermine the rule of law that we've been talking about?
Look, it does undermine the rule of law. Judges, no matter by whom they're appointed, are sworn to apply the law equally. It didn't used to be a thing to note, as applied to a judge's decision, it didn't used to be a thing for the press even to note who had appointed the judge. Unfortunately, we live at a time when if a judge or a lawyer or a lawmaker or the member of media does something that the current president finds distasteful, the people are called traitors and scum and lowlifes, and they ought to be impeached or investigated or prosecuted. People who do things that the current administration favors are referred to as patriots and heroes. And, look, eventually the notion that everybody who does something that the current administration doesn't like, the notion that all of those people are traitors or bums or rascals or corrupt will wear thin, I believe. But we'll all see.
Hasn't yet. On March 14th, as you're well aware, Trump went to the Justice Department and he made a speech in which he denounced judges as corrupt, prosecutors as deranged, political opponents as scum, as you've said, January 6 defendants, including violent defendants, as political prisoners. And those were sentiments that, for example, Senator Amy Klobuchar said were totally disgraceful. Do you agree with her?
I think it saddened many people who worked in the Justice Department and who hold the Justice Department in great reverence, and who have received awards and so on in the great hall of the Justice Department. For a lawyer, it's often the pinnacle of one's career to be mentioned in the hall of the Justice Department for one's achievements in furtherance of the rule of law. So to see a speech in that location lambasting opponents as scum and lowlifes, I frankly took as it's a sad occasion.
Then he went on to mention you by name in what you or I might regard as a badge of honor. And this is what he said.
Persecuted my family, staff, and supporters, raided my home, Mar-a-Lago, and did everything within their power to prevent me from becoming the President of the United States. With the help of radicals like Mark Elias, Mark Pomerantz, and these are people that nobody's ever seen anything like it.
Did you have anything to do with the raid on Mar-a-Lago?
Of course not. I was a prosecutor for a time with many, many others, and you try to follow the law and the facts to the best of your ability. But look, I'm not here to stick a pin in the side of the most powerful person on the planet. But I also have no regrets about the things I did as a prosecutor and as a practicing lawyer over the years. And I can say with no hesitation that anything I did as a prosecutor was in the effort to follow the facts where they led, to follow the law. And you put outside of your thinking the politics of the person you're investigating, because that just doesn't belong in the equation. Just as a surgeon, if you're taking out someone's spleen, you don't ask yourself as you make the incision whether the person on whom you're operating is a Republican or a Democrat. You try and do the best job you can. And prosecutors are supposed to act the same way. You take a look at the facts, you take a look at the law, you weigh all the surrounding circumstances, and you try and reach a legitimate decision. And that's all I ever did.
Is there anything about your conduct with regard to Donald Trump or anyone else that represented persecution of an individual or was radical?
No. Look, some of this is referenced in my book, but there were occasions when we were looking at potential charges, and if I thought there wasn't the law or the facts to warrant them, then I said, look, that's just not something we should consider doing.
So this administration took action against 3 law firms, Covington and Burling for pro bono work with Jack Smith, the Coey Perkins firm, and Paul Weiss for, I guess, seconding you to the district attorney.
I was mentioned along with other badges of infamy according to the order that came down.
Yes, but he said the reason, yes, there were others, but he said the reason for taking action against Paul Weiss was they released Mark Pomerantz to the district attorney. It's preposterous. And can you think of any other example in the history of the United States where the president has taken such action against lawyers or a law firm?
No, and as you know, in the Perkins-Coie case, a federal district judge has already entered a temporary restraining order to prevent the terms of the executive order from going fully into effect. I anticipate that Paul Weiss will seek similar relief, but I don't know, and I'm not privy to what the legal course will be, but it was profoundly distressing to see the order when it came down.
Another example of weaponization is that President Biden pardoned a number of people, forget about the merits of the pardon, just before he left office, including members of his family. And Trump argues that the pardons were signed with an auto pen and therefore weren't valid. I mean, isn't this weaponization?
Look, there are so many things that have happened over the last few months that go to the legitimacy of the rule of law, but that go beyond the rule of law. You know, when you have attacks against lawyers, attacks against law firms, attacks against judges, attacks against universities, attacks against the media, when anybody and any institution, any group of people that wants to criticize the current administration gets called out as being traitorous or whose activities should be curbed, you have to look at that and wonder what purpose lies beneath the surface. And that's a disturbing thing to think about.
Let's move on. We're here in New York City to the case against Mayor Eric Adams. There is pending before the court, as we sit here, a motion made by the government to dismiss a case that the government brought, which they concede is not based on the weakness of the case against Adams, or the law and the facts, or the rule of law. It's based on political considerations because Adams changed his position on immigration and is now willing to join in the government's crackdown. What do you make of all that?
You know, it's a very unusual set of circumstances to have the acting United States attorney take public issue with a decision by the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, and to state publicly that there's no basis for dismissing the case. That's an unusual set of circumstances. And when you look at the motion to dismiss the case, which the Department of Justice made, it essentially rests on two grounds. Ground one was so-called weaponization of the criminal process, because the prosecution supposedly interfered with New York's mayoral election. Although the indictment was brought 9 months before any New York City election, and obviously whenever an elected official is indicted and that person is facing re-election, well, that's going to interfere with that person's electoral prospects. But you don't give a carte blanche to any elected official because a criminal charge will interfere with that person's political future. When you drill down into what was the basis for the claim of weaponization, the DOJ pointed to two public statements, one a website, one an op-ed, that had been made by the former United States Attorney, essentially directing the public's attention to the fact that he had taken steps to combat public corruption. But even if one believes that the U.S. Attorney had political aspirations and that he found it convenient that prosecuting New York City's mayor would foster his political aspirations, that doesn't mean the whole prosecution goes out the window. One would think perhaps the judge would decide to probe the facts and see whether the prosecution was actually motivated by political motivations, by political reasoning. And I don't think there's any basis for that, for such a finding.
I mean, Judge Ho could conduct an evidentiary hearing, put on the former acting United States Attorney, ask her what the evidence was against Adams, would destroy him, absolutely destroy him.
Of course, of course. So, in fact, there's a presumption that an indictment, which after all is a finding made by impartial grand jurors, there's a presumption that the functions of a grand jury are regular, that when an indictment is returned, it's returned because grand jurors found there was probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and the defendant committed it. So we don't lightly toss out cases on the notion that they were tainted because somebody had an improper motive. In any event, there's a process for challenging an indictment as either a vindictive prosecution or a selective prosecution. But I don't think the government came into court before Judge Ho with any kind of showing to indicate that the reason Eric Adams was charged with the crimes in the indictment is because somebody wanted to make political hay about it. Okay, so that's basis one, was weaponization. Basis two was we need to dismiss the case because the pending charges are making it more difficult for the mayor of the city of New York to carry out the administration's policy with respect to immigration. Now, that is an odd argument on its face because the mayor of the city of New York already is under a duty to promote the public interest on all things, whether it's immigration or picking up the garbage or cleaning the streets from snow. And Mayor Adams has said...
Or inspecting buildings for violation of the fire law.
Indeed. And Adams has said loudly and often that the pendency of the indictment makes no difference to him. He's going to leave it to his lawyers. He's going to keep doing his job as mayor of the city of New York. Do politics creep into prosecutive decisions? Has that ever happened in the history of the United States? Of course, but it's not supposed to. And the notion that that's explicitly what we ought to be doing, that we ought to pardon political friends and prosecute political enemies, that's just not the way you can, that's not a nation that lives under the rule of law.
We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. This has been a marvelous interview. But I have a question for you. Trump has been in office now. Do you see the rule of law as being seriously compromised in the United States?
I think the rule of law is being challenged. I hope that legal institutions, that lawyers, that judges, that courts can continue to do the work that they exist to do. We have a tradition in the United States of having courts say the law and having the executive obey the law as it's articulated by the courts. I hope that tradition is not going to change. I hope that kind of the rule of law as an institution of American society remains intact. But do I think it's under threat? If you don't think it's under threat, you're not paying attention.
You're not paying attention. Sobering words. Mark Pomerantz, thank you so much for coming by. This has just been marvelous.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, be well, and all the best. And please get our app on your iPhone so you can hear our shows while you're on the run.